Can you talk a little bit about the purpose of the C&P exam and how it fits into the disability claims process?
Sure. It's helpful to go all the way back to the beginning, if you will. And the VA process was originally established to help veterans to get disability benefits as compensation for injuries or illness that they had suffered as a result of their military service. And it was intended as kind of a benevolent system where the VA would actively help the veteran to establish entitlement to benefits. And so that has come to be called the duty to assist. And the VA has a duty to assist veterans in developing their claims.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for benefits, subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome all. Today we are going to talk about the C&P exam, or compensation and pension exam, that is so integral to the VA disability process. Who are we? Well, I'm Francis Jackson. This is Christian Terrison, and we're from Jackson and MacNichol. And we're a law firm that specializes in getting justice for veterans on their VA disability benefits. And we do literally thousands of these cases from around the country. And so we want to take this opportunity to tell veterans a little about how the system works. So who is this show for? Well, it's obviously for veterans, but it's also for folks who care about veterans, whether you're family or a friend or just a member of the community looking to support veterans. This is the podcast for you.
All right. Well, as you mentioned, our topic for today is sort of the compensation and pension, or C&P exam. So can you talk a little bit about the purpose of the C&P exam and how it fits into the disability claims process?
Sure. It's helpful to go all the way back to the beginning, if you will. And the VA process was originally established to help veterans to get disability benefits as compensation for injuries or illness that they had suffered as a result of their military service. And it was intended as kind of a benevolent system where the VA would actively help the veteran to establish entitlement to benefits. And so that has come to be called the duty to assist. And the VA has a duty to assist veterans in developing their claims. Part of that is that if a veteran doesn't have his or her own medical person who is evaluating him and providing that information to the VA, then the VA is supposed to provide a medical evaluation and opinion about the particular claim that is being considered. And so that's where the compensation and pension exam comes from.
All right. And I guess, can you walk us through what typically happens at a C&P exam?
Yeah, the way it usually works is the C&P exams are contracted out, meaning the federal government, specifically the Department of Veterans Affairs, has a contract with a company whose process is to find local medical folks and arrange with them to do evaluations for which they pay them a certain amount of money. And those can be either physical or mental conditions. So it might be a review by a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. For a physical claim, it might be a review by a psychologist, or very rarely a psychiatrist for a mental health claim, but they're all contracted. So unfortunately, the side effect of that is that the company is trying to find people that they can pay a relatively modest amount of money to, so that the examiners tend to have an interest in doing this in the least possible amount of time for the amount they're getting paid. Those, sadly, are the realities.
Okay. And I guess in the exam itself, how would it be different from a physical that you'd get every year?
Well, it may not be much different, although we get complaints from veterans that actually their physicals are much more thorough in some cases.
Yeah.
But here's how it works. The VA employee decides that a compensation and pension exam is needed. They put together a request for an examination, and they will typically highlight certain records that they think the examiner should pay attention to. Theoretically, the examiner is going to look at the entire VA claims file. In reality, my experience is that often is not correct, that the examiner doesn't have the time or take the time to read the whole file. And the problem is that these files are not organized and indexed in a meaningful way in most cases. So you can literally have a file that is several thousand pages long, has lots of the same material repeated over and over in different places, and is really difficult to get specific information about a particular claim out of in any quick and easy way. So the net result is that examiners miss stuff. And it's just unfortunate because it often leads to exams that are not entirely accurate. Sometimes they're grossly inaccurate. Sometimes they're really good. But overall, they're okay, if you will. They're not great, but usually not really awful.
I know in the hundreds of cases I've personally worked on, when looking for errors in the report that comes out of a CMP exam, it's a rare case where I can't find something that was mixed up or done wrong.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes it's the really important part that gets mixed up or done wrong. And so it's a crapshoot, frankly. Sometimes there are really good CMP exams, sometimes they're not.
So how can veterans prepare for a CMP exam to ensure that it accurately reflects their condition?
Well, a couple of things. I think it's helpful for veterans to make a list of things that are important to their condition in terms of details of what happened in service. And if the particular event is not recorded specifically in their service records, they need to provide the examiner, I think, with a careful explanation of what happened and why it's not recorded in the records. In addition to that, it's really important that veterans complain. You know, one of the unfortunate side effects for purposes of VA compensation is, from the military mindset, is that folks are taught to be a little on the macho side, kind of power through, not be held back by pain or difficulty, and not to complain. And unfortunately, in these CMP exams, it's just the opposite. You need to complain. You need to sound like the worst whiner in the world because you need to get across to the doctor what the problems are. And if the doctor says, well, does your leg hurt? And it's actually so painful that when you have a flare-up, you're just limping around and can barely move, and you say, well, it's not too bad, then the doctor's going to think, well, it's not too bad. He's not going to know that you have flare-ups where you're barely able to get around for days at a time. So it's really critically important for veterans to really provide details about what difficulties they're actually having. Now, we don't want anybody making anything up. We just want people to accurately say what level of difficulty they're having. And one of the questions that is going to be asked about physical problems in particular, do you have flare-ups? And most people, for most physical conditions, have symptoms that vary in intensity. You know, today it's mild, tomorrow, it's a rainy day and cold, and it really hurts. And so it is really important for veterans to explain the severity and intensity of their symptoms if they want the doctor to understand it. But, the complaints I get from so many people are that, number one, the doctor was in a hurry and didn't want to listen. That's a big complaint. But another problem that is frequent and recurring, I've had spouses go with somebody to these things, and I've heard it in hearings where the person at the hearing will say, well, it's not too bad. And then when the wife testifies, she'll say, he said it wasn't too bad, but here's what really goes on. And so it's a problem. You really have the veteran prepare and explain exactly the level of difficulty they're having rather than minimize it.
All right. Is there anything a veteran should bring with them to a C&P exam? Anything like that?
I think it's sometimes helpful to bring any recent medical test results, MRI reports, X-ray reports, blood test reports, whatever kind of testing may be relevant to the condition that you're talking to the doctor about. I think it's very helpful for them to have the most recent stuff. And if this is something that occurred in service and was recorded, I think it's extremely helpful to literally offer the doctor a copy of the record showing, this is the day I got hurt, this is how it happened, here's the report. It's, I think, not a situation where the doctor will always accept the information, but there's no downside to trying to provide it.
Okay. And how does the VA decide when a veteran needs a C&P exam? And sort of related to that, can a veteran request that they have a C&P exam for a particular condition?
Sure. A veteran can always request a C&P exam. That doesn't mean they'll get it, but you can always request it. And in terms of how the VA decides, generally speaking, the way it works is if there is medical evidence that you have a current condition, whatever that condition is, and the regional office sees something in the file suggesting that in fact something occurred in service that could lead to that condition, then ordinarily they will set up a C&P exam. Now, sometimes they'll set up a C&P exam even when they've got good medical reports from people outside the VA system that explain what's going on and how it should be rated and everything else. But the flip side is that if they don't see something in the file that suggests that something happened in service to cause this problem, often they won't schedule a C&P exam at all, even if the veteran has carefully explained what happened and why it's related.
And what happens if a veteran disagrees with the findings of the C&P exam? What options do they have at that point?
Well, there are a couple of options. One is obviously to complain to the VA that the exam wasn't properly done, wasn't comprehensive enough, didn't consider the actual facts, and so on. I have not seen very many instances where the VA responded in any meaningful way to those complaints. But it's at least worth, if you are the veteran and you think the exam was not comprehensive enough, it's worth making sure that you put that in writing and it's recorded in the file. But the most meaningful thing, I think, is to have a private exam and a report if the C&P exam was not useful or not favorable. The VA doesn't put nearly as much stock, if you will, in outside reports, but at the appeals level at the board, they pay pretty careful attention to those reports. And a good report, a well-written report by someone with good credentials that carefully explains what's going on is often persuasive.
And I know that oftentimes when veterans are set for a C&P exam, they just get the notice in the mail with a date and a time. What should veterans be doing if they're unable to attend a scheduled C&P exam?
Oh, that's very important. If someone is scheduled for an exam and doesn't show up, that in and of itself is a basis for the VA to deny the claim. So it's really important, if someone can't attend the scheduled compensation and pension exam, to contact the VA right away and make sure that they explain that they can't go, why they can't go, ask to have it rescheduled, and get the name of the person that they talked to and ask them to make a record of it in the file, because I've seen a number of cases where a C&P was scheduled and the veteran couldn't go to the VA facility where it was scheduled or other location. And the veteran said they told the folks at the VA that, but all that shows up in the file is veteran didn't attend the exam, claim denied. So it's really important. It's best, if at all possible, to not only call, but to follow it up in writing and say, I called Jones today at the VA and told him I couldn't go to this exam and it needed to be rescheduled, and here's why.
Yeah, definitely the belt and suspenders approach.
Absolutely.
Because it's very easy for things to get lost in the shuffle over at the VA.
And that one is so critical, because that failure to show at the exam alone often leads to denial of the claim, no matter how good the claim is.
Now, are there any common misconceptions that you've encountered that veterans hold about C&P exams that you'd like our viewers to know about?
A couple. One is that the VA exams aren't very good and I shouldn't bother to go. Now, that, as you can see, puts them in the they didn't show for the exam and therefore their claim should be denied category, which is very bad. A second one is that I shouldn't have to, and this is particularly true of mental health claims, I shouldn't have to relive with this examiner stuff that's already in my file because it's distressing to me to talk about. So many times, if the veteran isn't willing to talk about an experience that led to mental health issues, the examiner will write that experience off as insignificant, even if it's actually devastating to the veteran, and that's why he can't talk about it. So that's another problem that we see a lot.
Mhm. Are veterans allowed to bring someone with them to the CMP exam? Family member, a representative?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I have never seen anything that says they can't, but I have heard stories of examiners saying, oh no, your wife can't come in with you, etc. I don't think there's actually anything that precludes someone from having someone accompany them at the exam, but it seems that's an issue that examiners don't necessarily agree with.
I was going to say, I've seen both in cases I've worked on. Actually, one case where the veteran was allowed to bring their spouse in, and the spouse provided a lot of necessary detail. This was a mental health case, and they had a lot more to say about the veteran's symptoms than the veteran did initially. And it was actually instrumental in getting them to open up in the context of the exam.
Yeah, I think it's useful to try to bring someone. As I said, I've seen situations where veterans have reported back that the examiner refused to allow anyone in.
Yeah, same here. So maybe we should look up the rule one way or the other on that one, get some guidance from the
I
VA.
don't think there is a rule. I can't find one.
Oh, okay. So you have looked. I should have known.
I've tried to find a rule. I don't see one. I think it's the examiner's discretion, essentially.
So where are the most common places that you see CMP exams go wrong for a veteran? They're in there, and I know you talked about.
Well, as I mentioned, I think the biggest thing is when veterans underreport their symptoms or are unwilling to talk about, in mental health cases, the distressing circumstances. Those are the biggest things. The other place that just goes wrong all the time is this whole business of it's scheduled, you can't go, you tell them you can't go, and then it still gets written up as refused to go to the exam, claim denied. Those just happen so often.
And then specifically for veterans with mental health claims, is there any difference in the CMP process for those folks, or is it comparable to what's out there for physical conditions?
Well, in physical conditions, the examiner is supposed to use, in most cases, an angiometer, a goniometer, and measure things like range of motion and that sort of thing. So it's very specific, if you will. Mental health cases are different in that it's really all about the veteran's symptoms and the importance of a careful explanation of the intensity and frequency of the symptoms, as you were alluding to earlier in your example. But it's very hard for a lot of veterans with mental health problems to really talk about, what events may underlie these problems or about the intensity, the frequency of the symptoms. One of the things that is a frequent issue, I think, is that veterans with serious mental health problems are very scared, terrified sometimes, that if they tell the examiner the extent of their symptoms, that they are going to be involuntarily hospitalized. We've had that issue many a time, and it's very difficult to resolve. A lot of veterans are just unwilling to talk about the severity of their problems for fear of hospitalization.
Dr. Quinn Austin Small, one of our providers we work with, who's a mental health specialist and a mental trauma specialist, was saying that to talk about those things re-traumatizes each time it's brought up. So, it's a real thing and it's a real problem. And unfortunately, because of how the disability claims process is structured, it's a necessary step if a veteran wants to have a successful mental health claim.
It is. It's very hard for some veterans to do that in a setting with an examiner they've never met before, have no familiarity with, no way to ease into it, if you will. It's just difficult, and it's a recurring problem with no apparent solution.
Yeah. And on that delightful note, we're out of time for today. This has been Victory Over VA. Please be sure to subscribe and tune in next week for the latest in Veterans Disability Benefits news.
And we'll see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.